What is up, creators? Today we're returning to the Edit series and we're going to try to replicate the style of Maleyphoto. So this profile does a lot of portraits, but it's a very contrasty and very warm style. And as always, it was a suggestion by a couple of you guys in the comment section on previous videos. So just as a reminder, if you have any other videos or styles that we're going to break down, put it down in the comment section and I'll check them out. So first of all, we're going to jump into Instagram, check out his style, the main characteristics, and basically break down what he does in post-edition. So with that knowledge, when we jump into Lightroom, we can edit a photo and create a preset out of it. So let's get to it. So creators, here we have Maley's profile on Instagram, Maleyphoto, if you want to go and follow him. And down here, you can also find the link to his website and to his preset shop. So if you're only interested in achieving his color grading, the best way to do it is to buy directly from him and all the other creators. The purpose of my tutorials isn't to steal styles, rather than we use these famous profiles. For example, he has 250,000 followers as an example to create the exercise to learn how to color grade in the process. If we take a broader look at his feed, we can notice that his style is basically split into. We have black and white photography, very contrasty with a lot of grain. And on the other hand, we have these sepia-like images. Now notice that all of these warm images are shot in warm environments that complement the color grading. For example, we have autumn leaves, then we have sunsets, then we have images at the beach. And in general, all the props complement the color grading or in the other way around. Now let's jump into the specifics. First of all, let's talk about the exposure and contrast, and then we're going to talk about the colors. Now, in terms of exposure and contrast, and this is the same for the black and white style as well, we have a very punchy looking image. We don't have any flattening on the curve. We don't have any highlights that are being brought down, so we have a flatter exposure, and we don't have any shadows that are raised dramatically, so we have loads of information. We're retaining a very natural looking contrast. Where we are losing a bit of information is in the blacks. Notice how the blacks, well, we don't see any detail in the shirt of the husband, and also the blacks are a bit grayed out, so we have to keep that in mind. Now, talking about color, the first thing that I can see is that we don't have any cold tones in the image. Blues, aquas, greens, purples, all of them are completely desaturated, leaving a void, and we only preserve the warm tones. Now, the skin tones, notice how the skin tones, they're not natural. They're very orangey, very tan, almost like if this family spent a week in the beach, but it's not quite natural. That's done in camera calibration in combination with HSL. Now, sometimes the style is very dramatic, highly saturated, highly warm, and in other cases, you can see how it's a bit nailed back. And right here, we're basically looking at an image that is very yellowish, but not because we're adding too much yellow or too much warmth. In the opposite, it's looking very warm because we are desaturating all the cold tones. All the grass, all the blues or aquas that should appear in the mountain in the background are completely gone. In this other image, a similar thing occurs. Notice how the sky, the sea, everything is completely desaturated, and also the greens. The greens are almost black and white in the grass. Where we don't lose saturation is in the warm tones in the sand in the foreground, and also the skin tones, but also pay attention to the white in the clothing. It's not white, it's a bit more orangey, and that's telling me that maybe in color grading they're adding this warm tone. Another thing that we need to mention is that all the images, not only the black and whites, have a very nice grain. As you can see over here, it's not too big, it's not too distracting, but it is there, just giving it a nice organic texture to the images. So from what I can observe, we have three main styles on his feed. We have the very saturated and warm image, then we have the same style but a bit more laid back with the saturation on the warm tones, and then finally we have the conversion of one of these styles into black and white. And all of these styles, we're going to replicate them today. So let's jump into Lightroom and start color grading. But as always, I have to remind you that these three presets that we're going to create today, I'm going to add them to the Edit preset pack V3, link up here if you want to check it out. In that preset pack, you're going to find all the presets that we create throughout the Edit series in this calendar year. So if you want to skip all my tutorials and you want to support me, just check them out. If not, don't worry guys, let's jump into Lightroom and start working away. Okay creators, here we are in Lightroom. I've selected this portrait. It's not the best portrait in the world, but it will serve to create the preset. Why? Because we have the skin tones, we have the blues, we have the greens, and we have an overall warm image. Now, we're going to start off with the basic corrections to achieve the contrast and exposure that we want, and then we're going to move down to the color grading. Now, for this tutorial, I'm using Lightroom Classic, but it's exactly the same process whether you're in Lightroom Mobile or in Lightroom Desktop. So basic corrections, we can call them highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks, and it's basically dividing our image into 4 parts, and we can alter them independently. Now, the tone curve does exactly the same, but in this case, we can add as many points or divide our image into as many parts as we want by adding more points into the point tone curve over here, not to be confused with the parametric tone curve over here. We can basically do the same things, but we're going to use them to complement each other. Now, first of all, highlights. Now, we don't want to go towards the positives, otherwise we introduce more brightness and therefore more contrast into our image. We want to go a bit more towards the negatives, just in order to preserve a bit more information in the highlights, not too much. We don't want a flat exposure, something like this. Maybe around the -25, -27 is going to be my value. Then shadows, we don't want to go towards the negatives to achieve a very dramatic and punchy looking image. We want to go towards the positives, and again, we do not want to go towards the +100, otherwise our exposure is completely flat and there's little to no contrast. So maybe around the 40s is going to be a good value. White will control the brightest points on our exposure. We're not going to move them, but we are going to move the blacks. Remember that image where the husband had a black t-shirt and we lost a lot of information? We're going to control that black in the blacks over here. So again, we're not going to go towards the extreme, but around the -10, -15 is going to be just enough. -11 is going to be the value that I'm going with. Okay, next up, the tone curve. Now in the tone curve, we can basically alter the exposure on our image, and we can even use it to color grade if we use the RGB channels over here. But I'm not going to go too into detail on it. I already made a specific tutorial about this tool, link up here if you want to check it out. So I'm just going to create a point in the shadows over here, then a point in the region of the highlights. Now this point in the highlights, I'm going to place it just in the diagonal over here without moving it in the input of 186 and the output of 186 as well. And what we're doing right here is just anchoring this point in the highlights so they're not altered. In the tone curve, what we're trying to do is alter the shadows and the blacks. So right here, our image is very bright. We need a bit more contrast. So I'm just going to pull down this point that controls the dark parts on our image or the shadows just below the diagonal. Notice as I go towards the negatives, our image is becoming a lot more punchy and contrasty. Towards the positives, it achieves more information and more brightness. So around these values, the input or the x-axis coordinates is 54, the output is 45. Now, finally, in the tone curve, I'm just going to fade out those blacks. There weren't pure blacks in the example images. So I'm just going to go towards the positive just a bit. And notice how the blacks turn into gray as higher as I go. So I'm just going to go around the 15%, just going to be enough. Not too crazy, you guys can play around. But in this case, just fading out those blacks so they're a bit grayed out. So we can see the before and after, what we did in the basic corrections and the tone curve. And we just have a bit more contrast in our image. The darks and the blacks are a bit more punchy and a bit more faded out. And then we have slightly more information in the shadows, preserving a bit better the highlights. Nothing too fancy. The main asset of this preset is done in the color grading, which we're going to get into right now. Now, first of all, in the color grading, the first thing that I want to achieve is the skin tones. And for that, we're going to use camera calibration. Camera calibration is a very powerful tool. And as you can see, it has the red primary, the green primary, and the blue primary. In other words, the RGB. Every single pixel on our digital image is composed of a mixture of these three colors to create the exposure. So even the blues over here are controlled in larger portions with the blue primary, but also with a bit of green and a bit of red. So you have to keep that in mind in order to really master this tool, because every single slider is affecting every single pixel on our image. So I'm not going to go too into detail again. This tool, we've already covered it in several tutorials. Link up here to the specific one about it. So in camera calibration, we want to achieve those orangey skin tones. And the logical step would be to move the red primary. But in moving the red primary, we can basically just change our skin tones into this yellow like from The Simpsons. We need to combine it with the blue primary to create a bit more of an orangey color. Now, why the blue primary? Because camera calibration works with color contrast. Opposite to the blue primary in the color wheel, let me just go up. You can see that the opposite color is the yellow. So by moving the blue primary, we are affecting all the colors, but the most affected ones by this slider is going to be the blue, and the direct opposite, which is the yellows. The same thing occurs with the red slider. We're going to affect the reds and the greens over here. So you have to keep that in mind when playing around with this tool. So first of all, red primary, just going to go towards the positives to change them into a bit more of an yellowish type of color. Now this is way too much. I wouldn't recommend to go to the +100 in any case, but just below the 50s is going to be enough, +47. Then saturation, with that more color, more red primary into every pixel on our image. And notice how the skin tones really start to pop a lot more, but also the greens in the background. So I'm not going to go too high over here. Maybe a 13% is going to be enough. And then our skin tones are looking a bit too yellowish. We need to add some orange into them. So blue primary, not towards the positives, but towards the negatives. Notice how the oranges start to appear and the blues really start to accentuate as well. So I'm not going to go too towards the extremes, maybe just around the -15% is going to be enough. And the saturation, just put it up as well around a +15, just to add a bit more vibrance into the skin tones. And as you can see now, the skin tones are acquiring this very nice orangey tint. At the left, we have the original image, white, almost pinkish, and now we have those orangey tan skin tones that we were looking for. Now, as a consequence, with playing around with camera calibration, we've also altered all the other colors in our image. That's why the blues are so intense, the greens are a bit crazy, so we need to correct that in HSL. Now, we're going to move up to HSL now, and HSL, well, I call it HSL because it's still the name, but now it's included within Color Mixer over here. We have Mixer and then HSL. And HSL stands for Hue, Saturation, and Luminance, and those are the values that we can alter with this tool. So first of all, saturation. We need to desaturate a lot of the cool tones like we saw in all the example images. Blues, greens, magentas, all of them are gone. And then we're going to just desaturate in general the entire image, but more on that further along. So first of all, let's start with the blues. Blues, I'm going to go towards the -60s, a bit dramatic. Also the aquas, then purples as well. And the magentas, I'm not going to move them too dramatically because sometimes we can find a lot of magenta, in particular in the lips, on the skin tones, or any blemishes. So I'm not going to go too low, around the -20, but we are desaturating them quite a bit. Now the same thing is going to occur with the reds and the oranges that control all of the skin, as you can see. Again, towards the negatives, or the -20 for both of them. And then the greens. The greens we saw that were highly desaturated. So I'm going to go all the way to the -90 with the deep greens. And then as you can see, the yellow controls all of the brighter foliage in the background. So I'm just going to go around the -60 as well. Okay, so our image is looking very dramatic. Lastly, before we move on, I'm going to move to hue over here. I'm just going to change these greens over here into not warmer tones towards the negatives, but towards the positives ever so slightly, change them a bit more towards the cooler tones. This is just a detail that I observed in the beach photo example image. So a value around the 36 in the deep greens and then around the 30 in the yellow. Just changing them a bit more towards the cooler tones, even though they're highly desaturated. We're desaturating most of the tones, which isn't quite enough. I'm just going to desaturate a bit more with the general slider of saturation towards the -15. So right here, you're probably looking at this image and saying, this is looking horrible. It's very desaturated, very monochromatic. But in essence, what I'm doing right here is reducing the intensity of all the tones that I don't want to be relevant in the image, with the exception of the skin tones. And then I'm going to fill that desaturated void with the color of my preference, which is going to be that orangey sepia that we saw in the example images. And for that, we're going to use the color grading tool over here. So color grading, this tool was previously known as split toning, but in essence, what it's doing is dividing our image into 3 parts: shadows, midtones, and highlights. And we can basically place a tint into any of these slots. We can also use the global color wheel all the way at the right to paint our entire image with a certain color. So here also, we're going to decide which preset that we're going to make. We can create a more of an intense one, the sepia-like, and also we can create the most subtle one. So first of all, let's create the most intense one, the very orangey and very warm images that we saw in the examples. So I'm going to use the global color wheel over here, and it's very simple, it's very intuitive. You can basically move the point in the center towards the border to add more saturation, and then just scroll it around to find the hue that you want. In this case, I'm going to go with the hue of 37, this orangey type. You can also play around, maybe one more of a natural yellow, just go up, or a bit more reddish towards the bottom. And the saturation, I'm just going to drag it down around the 34. This is very intense, and as you can see, our image is starting to look a lot more orangey, but this isn't quite enough. I'm just going to complement this with adding a tone into the midtone. So I'm just going to right click, copy the settings because I'm interested in copying these values. I'm going to go into the midtones and just right click, paste settings. And right here, we're introducing a bit more of that orangey tone into the midtones. Now, why the midtones? Because in the midtones, we have our skin tone. So what I'm doing is just adding a bit more saturation, a bit more orangey tones into the orangey skin tones that we already had with the movements that we did in camera calibration. Now, the saturation right here is too intense. So I'm just going to go a bit down. 19 or 20s is going to be just enough. And as you can see, our image is very dramatic, very sepia, and very orangey. So you guys can also play around. Maybe you want to add a bit less saturation or a bit more, or you can want to add it to the shadows or to the highlights. I'm just going to leave it like that, global and midtones. So this is the sepia preset, the most intense one, but we're missing one step. So I'm just going to go to the effects tab over here, and we're missing the grain. The grain was very notorious in the example images, and right here we have a very clean photo. So I'm just going to add a bit of amount over here just to see what we're working with. And as you can see right now, we have a very fine grain over here. So I'm just going to pull up the size, maybe around an 85, just to make it this very gritty and very big grain in our image. And then the amount, I'm just going to reduce it just a bit around the 45s. Roughness, I'm happy with those values. Now, just a little disclaimer about the grain. This tool will vary depending on the resolution on your image. So right here in this image, which was shot at 24 megapixels with my APS-C camera, the grain looks like this, these values. But maybe if I apply these settings into an image which is smaller, the grain is going to be a lot bigger. So you always have to keep that in mind, that grain is sensitive depending on the resolution on your image. So right here we have an image which is 3800 pixels times 5700. And so just keep that in mind when you're applying the grain. Maybe you need to adjust it depending on the size of the images that you're working with. So I think this preset is complete. Before we move on to the next one, let's save it and apply it into a couple of other photos to see if we did a good job or if we need to modify it. So to save a preset, you're going to go to the left panel over here. At the top where you have presets, you're going to select the plus sign over here in the drop down menu, create a preset, and you can name it. And remember that you do not want to mark any of the values that we didn't use. For example, white balancing, exposure and contrast, we like to omit them. Just as detail, sharpening, transform, and or any other value that you didn't use, don't include it in the preset. So how about over here, we have this portrait of this guitarist, and notice how his skin is a lot darker, a lot more tan. So let's see how the preset performs over here. I'm just going to apply it. And there we have it, a very dramatic looking image. The skin right here is very orangey, and you can also play around if it's too much with the camera calibration over here. Deactivate it, activate it, just adds a bit more brightness into it. But in general terms, it looks quite nice. Over here in this image of this old guy just reading a book in Venice, let's apply the preset and it just looks fantastic over here. Notice immediately how the blues in the shadows disappear and they're supplanted by this orangey tone. Skin tones orangey as we wanted, and also the grain is quite nice in our image. I think we did quite a good job. It's a very dramatic look, but it's very similar to what we saw in the feed of Maley. Okay, moving back to our first image, now let's create the variant, which is a bit more soft, a bit more useful, less dramatic. And for that, what we're going to do is just go to color grading once again, and we're just going to reduce the intensity of the color. So the global color wheel over here, we're not going to use it, just double click to reset it. And then we just left with the midtones over here. And in this case, I'm just going to leave them because I do want a bit more orange added into the midtones and into the skin tones in particular, but not into the entire image. And then we have an image which is highly desaturated, but we're still retaining a bit of that warmth. So just like that, we created another variant. And with another click of the button, we can create the third variant, which is the black and white. We're going to select V on our keyboard, in our keyboard V, and we're going to change into monochrome, and you can see immediately how our image is changed into this black and white. Now, a few changes over here. First of all, we do not want color grading because we are affecting our image with the color grading still. Just going to reset this. We don't want a sepia black and white. And also, I'm just going to move up to the tone curve over here. I'm just going to bring back a bit more of the blacks. They're too faded out right here. Just going to reduce a bit of the faded effect just towards the negatives. Maybe around the 7, just to add a bit more punch into the blacks, and then we have our black and white style with that dramatic grain. Now, of course, you guys can add a bit more contrast by moving the black over here towards the negatives, or moving this point over here that controls the shadows in tone curve towards the negatives to have a dramatic effect. But in this case, I'm just gonna leave it like that. Let's save these two presets and move on to see how they perform. Okay, so back to the image of the guitarist. As you can see, we have the sepia applied. Always remember that we can also play around with the amount slider. We have this in all versions of Lightroom. In Lightroom Classic, it appears up here. You can play around with the amount of the preset that is applied. If you want a less dramatic effect, you go towards the negatives. Towards the positives, you have a bit more of an intense look. And then we can apply the soft. As you can see, all these presets are already in the Edit Like Preset Pack V2. And the soft one, while it's still retaining a bit of that warmth, we still have that desaturation, but it's a bit more useful. It's not too dramatic or too intense. And then finally, we have the black and white, which has this punchy looking rock star effect, and it looks fantastic. Finally, let's see them in this image with a lot of awesome colors in the background. So let's apply, first of all, the soft version over here, which has this film grain, this desaturation, and just looks fantastic. I really like how these turned out. Then we have black and white, which is very dramatic as well. Nice contrast. And then finally we have the sepia, which is the intense look, and it just looks fantastic. I love how the colors in the background of the autumn leaves really start to accentuate because we added them in camera calibration, but it just looks fantastic in my opinion. So creators, I hope you achieved some knowledge out of this video, in particular what we did in HSL with color grading, where we strip away some of the colors and then replacing them with an entirely different tint. This is a great way to create very dramatic, very stylized looks. Also creators, I have to remind you that these 3 presets, I've already included them into the Edit Like Preset Pack V3 and also the Edit Like LUT Pack V3. Yes, I've reconverted all these presets into LUT so you can apply them into your video as well. Also up there you can find my personal presets and personal LUTs that I use every single day to edit all my work. So if you can support me in that manner, I'd be very thankful, because we all know that YouTube AdSense pays basically nothing. So if you can support me, thank you. If not, don't worry guys, just like the video and share it. That really helps me out. I'm Tony Fuentes. Cheers to all of you, and I'll see you in the next one.